Welcome everybody to another edition of our Byron Community Podcast and our guest, Dr. Howard Chilton. Thanks for joining us, Howard.
It's a pleasure.
We found each other a very strange way, and my daughter and son-in-law just had a baby, and when they were just after the birth of their baby, referencing a book that two of my daughter's friends had also read and was extremely useful after childbirth. I found out who the author was, but I didn't know you lived in our part of the world. And to make it even stranger how we end up sitting across from each other, I tracked you down, in essence, in our part of the world because someone told me they thought you were here somewhere, but I didn't know exactly where. How did you, an Englishman, end up living in our part of the Northern Rivers, and what's your journey to here, to be sitting here today?
I had a very convoluted journey. I trained in London. I'm a Yorkshireman, trained in London. And after I registered, I couldn't wait to get away. So I went to South Africa and did an adult medical job in Durban. And that was great. I enjoyed that thoroughly. But I thought before I leave South Africa, because I needed to go back and do further training, I'd better do a pediatric term. So I looked in the journals and found there was a neonatal job in Salisbury at Harare Hospital. This was in the days when it was Rhodesia. And I applied and got that and drove up to Salisbury, and I had no intention of doing pediatrics. Couldn't stand kids, actually, when I was training. I thought pediatrics was a very messy business. And I went and started that neonatal job in the Black Hospital in the capital of Rhodesia, and within 3 days, I was complete. It was like an epiphany. I thought, this is what I wanted to do. The babies were just extraordinary. What wonderful patients. They're all so cute, and they also have such potential. I was dealing before with people who were 70 or more, which is fine, but to be dealing with brand new little humans who are extraordinarily cute was just an eye-opener for me. And so from then on, I set my sights on neonatology and went back to England with the help of the professor who gave me the job in Rhodesia, I might say. He rang his friend at the Hammersmith and got me this great job at the Hammersmith back in London. And I took it from there and kept on working until I had to do my BTA, Been to America, qualification. And in 76, went to Denver, Colorado, and did 2 years with their neonatal team at Denver Children's Hospital, which was extraordinary. And then with about 3 weeks to go, I didn't know what to do. And I was phoned up by a friend of mine who I'd met at Oxford, who said, we've got a job in Sydney. Would you like to do it? Now, I'd popped into Sydney in 74 and 76 on my way over to the States, and I really enjoyed it. And I couldn't believe that I was being offered a job at the only hospital I actually had ever visited in Sydney, in the Royal Hospital for Women in Paddington at the time. And strangely enough, got the job. And so arrived in Sydney in 78 and looked for my previous girlfriend, who I'd met in 76, and she'd gone back to London, though she was an Australian. And that was a bit disappointing, but so I started work as the director of newborn care at the Royal Hospital for Women in 78, and I met some wonderful people who had a holiday home in Byron, and went up to visit, and it was just extraordinary. I thought, this is where I want to end up. Also, the guy who had invited me up, he'd driven a Winnebago round Australia, from all the way around. He said, this is the best place in Australia, look no further. And I always believe everything he says, actually. He's a very smart guy. He's still there in Bangalore. and Tony Parks. He does.
I know Tony.
He does land care.
Yeah,
So
he does more than land care. He's an inspirational human being. Tony.
He is into his 5th or 6th career at the moment.
He's going to be on our podcast in a little while.
Is he?
Yes.
Wonderful. Grab him as soon as you can.
Yep.
So that's really how I arrived here.
Take us back to Yorkshire. Lots of famous people have come out of Yorkshire. Michael Parkinson, I think, was a Yorkshireman.
Oh, yes.
And lots of great cricketers amongst others. But what was it like growing up in Yorkshire in your younger years?
Oh, typical parochial north of England. You thought it was the centre of the world. And then my parents thought that I needed a real education. My dad worked he was a classical scholar and worked at the University of Hull. He thought I needed to learn Greek and Latin and do it properly, so he sent me to British private public school, what is called. So they sent me to a drafty Gothic pile in Derbyshire at the age of 12 or 13. And so I didn't have much of Yorkshire after that, except in the holidays. But if I hadn't gone to boarding school, I would not have worked hard enough. So few distractions on the top of a hill in Derbyshire. So I was able to do some work and get to university and end up doing medicine.
You went to Oxford?
No, I went to London. I went to St Mary's Hospital Medical School. I went to Oxford later doing a neonatal job with the famous Professor Tizard in 74, 75, something like that. And that was actually my first full-blown neonatal job. And it was pretty extraordinary. And from then, I went to Great Ormond Street, the famous children's hospital, just to complete my education, and then went off to the States.
You've lived in lots of different places. I've noticed from this conversation and from the brief one we had a moment ago, that when you visited here in the 70s, I've heard a lot of people say they visit here in some stage in their life and they have this knowing in there that they want to come back or they'll end up here or something, or they'll put down real roots. What was it about the place other than the wisdom of Tony and his Winnebago journey? What was it when you came here? With anyone who doesn't understand the contrast, and I'm sure everyone does, but the contrast between here in winter and Yorkshire in winter are pretty strong. But in the 70s, this was an amazing area in that period. I was here in that period surfing lots and lots of time. But what was it in the knowing of you that you were going to come back here? This was going to be the place that you were going to ultimately live?
Well, I always felt that I believe in synchronicity. And I certainly felt a deep synchronicity when I arrived here. And I thought, I've got all the freedom in the world. I had no family and I could go anywhere I wanted. I tried Durban. It's okay. I thought it was kind of fun, but it looked like it was going downhill, which it was. And when I came to Australia, that was going uphill fast. So I pretty well determined that if I could, I would come to Australia and Byron eventually. Of course, being a neonatologist, you need a city of at least 2 to 3 million people in order to function. Because
Why? Why do you need that many people?
Because you need a big population centre to have intensive neonatal care.
Yeah.
You can't do a little bit here, a little bit there. You need to concentrate them. You need to regionalise neonatal care so that when babies are very little or very sick, they need to go to a big centre that has lots of beds and has lots of experience. So you're stuck in a big city. And so I got stuck in a big city, Sydney, for 30 years. And it's only since COVID I was able to actually move here permanently.
So COVID did you a favour and
yes,
fast-tracking you to move to
Well,
this
I was
part?
commuting for a few years before that. I left neonatal intensive care after about 25 years at the sharp end. It's a young man's game. And I then retired from intensive care and got into really parenting education and what I call reassurology.
I love that word. I saw that written in one of your books.
Yeah, looking after big babies and their parents who are always pathologically anxious. And I thought that was a good job. So
Let's talk a bit about your books. You've written a bunch of books,
Yeah.
and I came to you virtually via the last book that you'd written. But let's talk a little bit about books. You've developed all that wisdom and experience. You've worked with the little babies in their intensive care and so on. When did you decide to start writing books and become an educator?
My first book was about 1990, and that was really, it was a magazine book by Bay Books, I think. Yes, it was called The New Baby Book, and it was a collection of, because I was giving talks all the time. Mm-hmm. When parents have got a new baby, they will ask incessant questions and you're making incessant answers. So I thought I ought to write them down. And I wrote this first book, which was sort of a magazine-y kind of book, and then got interested in anthropology and ethology, behaviorism and primatology. And there's a wonderful book called Mother Nature by a woman called Hardy, who's a primatologist. Once you see the depths of information that's available to parents, if they could only access it, and it can only be distilled from these tomes into something readable. So I had this passion to try and explain stuff. And so I've been explaining stuff ever since.
Well, you said to me your books are full of facts. They are, but the way you explain those facts is it's like having a conversation with you. I'm sitting talking to you now.
Yes.
Your books read like a conversation.
Yes, and in fact, I dictated a lot of them.
Well, they when you read them, it feels like that. So
Yeah.
it feels like you're next to someone talking you through the book. They're conversational. I did read one thing that you said in there that I'm particularly interested in and to talk about when young people have babies. There's two things that sit amongst all of the other challenges they have. The first is a lack of sleep, which is common knowledge, but the next one is advice.
Yes.
They get this advice from all over the world, and I often wonder, being an older human now, what I would have been like if I had a child now, because you've got Dr. Google and all of these other things. But how do you manage, anyone listening to this who's had a baby or gonna have a baby, how are they supposed to manage all the advice that's available now?
I think you need to understand why new parents get all that wonderful advice.
Yeah.
And the reason is babies are designed to be immensely cute and attractive, and everybody wants to help. So you've got this incredible yen, if you see a baby, to join in and give the mother some helpful advice. And the trouble is that the advice comes in two brands. There's the old-fashioned way is the routine-based parenting model, where it's very important that you put your baby into a good routine as soon as you get home. And, they are basically very manipulative and demanding. And if you let them get away with it, you'll just spoil them. And all this stuff, it's been going on for literally hundreds of years. You read the old baby books of the 1920s, it makes your hair stand on end. Don't be too affectionate to your baby or he'll just get used to it and you'll spoil him. This stuff. But you see, this went on till about the 50s or 60s, and then in the 1960s, a few paediatricians came along who'd also been trained in psychology and psychiatry and psychoanalysis. I'm thinking Winnicott and Bowlby, and they British guys. And actually, I met Winnicott once when I was training. I didn't know it. I didn't know I was in the presence of godlike creature, but there he was. And what they realized was babies are fundamentally extremely immature. Their wants and their needs are identical. They cannot manipulate anything. They are so immature that really the instincts of the parents should be paramount. And every parent, when the baby cries, they want to go and pick him up, pick her up, give her a hug, feed her, whatever. And these are the instincts which have been suppressed for years by the starchy group who wanted to put everything into routines, not least of all the formula companies. Now, the formula companies have been around since the the late 1800s, and they decided that 4-hourly feeding was appropriate. It makes absolutely no sense. Human milk is a continuous contact milk because we are a continuous contact species. And 4-hourly, if you're lucky, you'll be lucky to get 4-hour break. And anyway, breasts are not designed to be fed, to be emptied 4-hourly. And neither are babies designed. So this was madness, it always was. And to try and shoehorn these poor little immature babies into this pattern was just outrageous. Along come the anthropologists who told us that the reason for all of this is the fact that human babies are the most immature placental baby on the planet. We are more immature than all the apes, all the other mammals. And the reason for that is we've got tiny little pelvises because we'd walk around on our hind legs. Once we became an erect biped, it was game over for having big babies because you have big buttresses of bone on the inside of your hip joints, and it makes your pelvic outlet so much smaller. And this was fine 200,000 years ago when we started it because the brain size was relatively small. But then all of a sudden we have this explosion of brain size, and all of a sudden we have what is called the obstetric dilemma. How do you get a big brain baby out through a narrow athletic pelvis? And the only way you can do that and not lose mother and baby from impacted birth is by having the baby way earlier in pregnancy than any other placental mammal. And so what we have when we have a newborn baby is not an independent person. We've got an exterior gestate fetus. We've got a fetus on the outside, and they need exactly the same level of care as they got in the womb. Now they're on the outside. And there's nothing, it's a continuum. They need continuous food, continuous cuddles, continuous protection. They're terrified of predators. They know they're completely, at some level, they know they're completely helpless. And when there isn't a mother in their immediate vicinity, they'll raise hell. And that's the way they're designed. And to try and put them in another room in a separate cot is just crazy. Just makes no sense. Makes no biological sense, and it doesn't make any practical sense either.
Howard, you must have, over the years, I'm going to guess, been the collector of some of the strangest advice that's ever been given to all of these young mums.
Yes.
You must have heard some stories. What are young people even today? What sort of advice are they given?
Well, don't wear a black bra because it will discolour your milk. And you should get all the shelves of your kitchen down below waist level, because if you raise your arms while pregnant, you will strangle your baby. I mean, yes, but even relatively harmless sounding advice can be really devastating. And I'm thinking mostly to do with feeding and sleeping routines. I mean, that's what I rail against, this idea that you can take an immature baby who's only got 25% of his brain formed at the time he's born, and you try, and he has no memory, no sense of time, to try and put him into a routine is just madness. And it will only lead you to further tears from baby and parents.
How long does it take after the birth of a baby before it's relatively mature in terms of its brain forming and so on? Is it 12 months? Like what sort of time?
Good question. I think we leave our childhood behind at 25.
Yeah.
Babies they double their brain weight in the first year of their life. Now, the 25% of the brain that they have at birth is all of the neurons. They've got 100 billion packed in that little skull. But what they don't have are the connections. And it's the connections that the babies start to pile on as soon as they've escaped from their mother's pelvis. And they really put on a staggering amount of brain weight and load up with connections. And the connections, they've 40,000 connections a second. So they've got this burgeoning brain development where they're looking around and sucking in as much information as they can use. And it's the first 18 months is, maybe 75% of those connections will be laid down in their first 18 months. So your first couple of years are the critical times when you can alter the baby's brain anatomy. Now, I'm jumping ahead here. The way the connections are made are obviously based on genetics to start with, but once you've laid down those tracts, whether you use them or whether you don't determines the thickness of the connections. And the more you use them, the thicker they are, and the faster they are, and the more efficient they are. And the ones you never use, they're whittled away and disappear. So you have this brain molding, and it's molded by the behavior of the people around the baby. They're the ones who are literally changing the baby's brain anatomy by their interaction with it.
When a baby is born, my recent observation is because you're new at it as a parent, all of these things happen, and because you don't have your expert there with you all of the time, in essence, what you require or need is someone to tell you that's normal, that's normal, that's normal. And what I'm getting at here is how do you, when you're a young parent, work out whether something that's happened to your child or something that is happening to your child regularly is a normal thing as opposed to something that you need to take them to the hospital? How do you work that out?
Well, you probably ask your mother. There's no doubt that throughout the world, the anthropologists have noticed that if there's a maternal grandma on the scene, these babies do a good deal better, certainly in the developing world and probably in the developed world as well. So, yeah, I mean, you ask things. The trouble is that if you ask 23 people, you'll get 23 different pieces of advice. And I wrote the book because what I was trying to do is to lay down what the science is underlying the baby's needs so that you can make your own decisions. I mean, it makes no sense to put the baby in the east wing of your house so that he's out of sight and out of hearing and he's non-responsive. I mean, it makes no sense. So parents tend to, they're actually equipped with all the instincts they need as long as they relax and try and use the most important things of parenting, which is common sense and trial and error. If you do those things, if you trial and error something and it doesn't work, your baby will let you know, no time. So the thing is that you just need to give it a go. And babies, the other thing I kept telling parents for decades is babies are tough as old boots. They look terribly, certain things you shouldn't do to babies. You've got to keep them close, never shake them, they need warmth and they need regular food and they need cuddles and they need love and protection. But as long as you've got common sense and you try it, and your baby will tell you whether it works or not. And babies, there's a normal distribution curve for how babies behave. You've got self-soothing babies, and that's the baby next door who's been sleeping through the night since we got him home from the hospital. And there are babies like that, but they're not very common. And at the other end of the scale, you've got the super sensitive baby who squeaks every time everything isn't perfect. And the mother with the super sensitive baby is going to run around and ask for a heck of a lot more advice than the one with the self-soother. Mothers groups can be helpful, but you've got to be wary about who's running the mothers group, who's the head honcho, and do they have any strange beliefs? Because once you've brought up a baby, you'll probably, and a lot of mothers are tempted to write a book about how to do it. And I know some celebrities who've done just that. And they think they're an expert. And, that can be very unhelpful if you've got somebody who's trying to make sure that everyone underlines how good a job they did by doing it their way. And that can be a bit of a task.
I love the term self-soother. I know a bunch of adults that would be very well served in being able to find a way to be self-soothing of themselves on a regular basis.
Well, that's probably because of the way they spent their first couple of years, because that really lays down the kind of temperament and the kind of personality you have. Because one of the important linkages you get in that first couple of years is linking the fight or flight amygdala, the bit that is scanning for threat, and your thinking brain. Now, we don't have any connections when we start, but they pretty well lay them down. But then, depending on how your environment treats you, tells you which of the connections to your thinking brain work and which ones don't. So if you have laid back, loving parents, you learn that I should remain calm. Just like these people. This is really cool. So these babies lay down in their brain, their thinking brain, cortisol receptors. And cortisol is your stress hormone, and these receptors mop it all up, and it calms the baby down. So the baby learns how to keep calm. If, however, you've got unpredictable cold and parents who you can't make head or tail of what they're going to do next, you tend to become very hypervigilant, and you accept a relatively higher level of stress within your brain. And you have fewer cortisol receptors in your brain, and you can end up an inherently anxious person because of the way your parents, your loved ones, trained you in your first couple of years. This is what I'm talking about. And I gave a talk at the Royal to the postnatal mothers every week for about 15 years, and that was my take-home sentence. What you can do now is create your baby's personality. And Gopnik, Professor Gopnik of Berkeley, wrote a wonderful book called I can't remember. Anyway, she wrote a wonderful book about babies, and there was a lovely phrase. She said, "You can't much help what your baby will do in the future, but you can give them a wonderful past." And that's the point. You've got to give your babies a wonderful,
that's a
loving,
great quote.
Just teach them. Now, the way you teach your baby how to calm themselves is by what is called serve and return interactions. All mothers know this. They start talking to their babies in almost continuous commentary after a few months, and they're smiling and interacting with their babies. They talk to their baby in a very special voice. It's called motherese, and they speak very high, about an octave over what they would normally do, very slowly, and they enunciate the consonants and they draw out the vowels because that attracts their baby. And so with these serve and return, and when the baby reacts to their conversation, the mother reacts to the baby, and they have what is called a proto-conversation. And that's how the baby learns how to mirror his mother's emotions and learn how to calm himself. And that's what parents are for. They're teaching their babies how to, emotional intelligence, how to keep themselves calm.
I always enjoy asking people who've practiced their profession for a long time that the changes and the differences between between what it's like practicing now compared to 30 or 40 years ago. What are the biggest changes you've seen from the delivery part to the looking after children during the period that you've been practicing?
That's a very good question. I remember when I first came to the Royal in '78, Le Boyer had just described gentle birthing. And before this, it was all stainless steel and bright lights and lithotomy position. And well, even in the British Museum, they had a little Aztec mother's statue, which was lying on her back. And in fact, they didn't recognize it. And the front of the knees were 2 pads. The thing was meant to be sitting upright. And finally, people started to realize that actually walking around in labor and baths and water births, all this sort of thing.
We were the water birth capital of the world in that period of time, I think, up here.
I remember I was on 60 Minutes when something went badly wrong in the early 80s up in Nimbin. Anyway, yes, so there was a lot of movement to make birthing more appropriate, let fathers in, which I think is usually good. However, it is a very gory and brutal happening, and some fathers, I've always said, fathers need permission to leave at any time without any questions, because it can be a little overwhelming for some men. And however, they are absolutely invited, and that was certainly a most important leap forward, explaining to mothers what was happening. The other thing I found when I arrived at the Royal, if there was a stillbirth, the stillbirth was removed, and mother never saw it. And that was the kindest way to treat that situation. That changed rapidly. I have to say, on my pressure, because we realised how important it was for that mother to bond with the baby that she loses, as well as the baby that she doesn't. And so that was a major change. There was a massive change to the management of the preemie baby, and I'll never forget when surfactant arrived. The lung is made up of millions of little bubbles, and lining the bubbles is a detergent which we secrete into our lung tissue. Preemie babies are not very, very good at that, and that's why they have stiff lungs and they go on a ventilator. And my first several years in neonatology was just hard work, ventilating these babies with high pressures and very extreme management, and they would get burst lungs and all that sort of thing. And then first the Japanese and then others started to inject the surfactant from cows' lungs into babies. And it was miraculous. Suddenly the phone didn't ring at night, because you could actually have these preemie babies' lungs just soften up literally within minutes. And so the pressures needed to ventilate those lungs was much lower. The incidence of pneumothorax was much reduced. And all of a sudden, everything became much more appropriate. And for the very small babies, the less than 28 weekers, we were suddenly starting getting good quality saves. Because when I arrived in 78, a 28 weeker was considered a super micro preemie. Now we're talking 23, 24 weeks for a micro preemie. But in those days, even a 1,000 grammer was in dire straits, might not survive, but we stopped losing 28 weekers very often following the introduction of surfactant. And then ventilators. You see, when we started, we were using adult ventilators, which were modified for baby use. And then the company started making special ventilators for babies. And all of a sudden, things really became very much more successful. Because most of the problems for babies is their lung problems, converting to air breathing when they're immature is a real problem for them. And all of a sudden, the lung problems sort of almost went into the background, and then we ended up with worrying about nutrition and intravenous feeding and a lot of technical stuff, which allowed us to look after babies smaller and smaller successfully. And that was the important thing. We could sometimes keep babies alive, but they would not be in good condition. And that was a real tragedy for the family. And I always took that to heart.
I understand not only the attraction but the joy and fulfillment of being able to bring the babies into the world. But I guess the other side of that is that as opposed to older people or being a doctor in the space with older people, it must be very difficult with babies when babies don't live, when babies don't survive that process. How does a doctor, particularly with your experience, how do you deal and how did you deal with that part of the job?
I actually found that part of the job very satisfying because one can make a difference with very little effort, as it were. So it's really important to understand the process. Just because the baby's a late stillbirth doesn't mean that the baby is, he still is a human being, he's part of that family, and they'll never forget him, and they just have to incorporate it into the tapestry of their life, and you can help them do that by counselling. And I actually did a couple of really intensive counselling courses about grief counselling in particular to help deal with not only my own feelings but also the feelings of the parents. I can still remember I had a week at the Royal somewhere deep in the 80s where I lost a baby a day for 7 days, and that was fairly tough. But so many of the babies did survive and did survive well, and that was made everything worthwhile. Though, you know, it was stressful. It was very stressful.
Do you get a chance, have you had a chance over the years to meet any of the grown-up babies who've gone through those difficult times and popped up later or run into them? I'm going to imagine that would give you great joy.
Yeah, I can still remember I went to a delivery at the Royal in the 90s, late 90s, and was it later? I can't remember. And a guy said, "Hello, my name's Nathan, and you looked after me and he showed me this picture of an 800 grammer."
Is
and
that
I
right?
remembered him, and I remembered that baby because 800 grammers didn't do well in the late 70s when he was born, and I remember him very well. I'd only been at the Royal for a couple of years, and so I was still under scrutiny from the older obstetricians.
Yeah.
And he was one of my successes, and he came along and had a baby of his own, and it was just delightful. And I've probably met 5 or 6 that I can think of premies who've had babies and have brought their babies back to me, which is delightful.
Oh, I couldn't think of anything to give you more joy and fulfillment in that space.
Absolutely.
Before we run out of time, and as an Englishman I know who came to our country at one stage or went and has taken up surfing or did take up surfing, I'm interested, now that you live up in this part of the world, the parts of our area that you love and the parts that when you've got visitors and so on you take people to. What are your special places up here on the North Coast, your own?
Oh, the beach.
Yeah.
Yes, the beach. I enjoy hiking also, but I have to say, as a Yorkshireman who's used to drizzle, I really love the weather. I have to say.
Howard, thank you very much for being part of our podcast.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.